Welcome everyone, this is Honest Restart, and this time I want to talk about Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. So this game was recently revealed to be coming out this November for Nintendo Switch, and apparently it's Nintendo's big holiday game for the year, and I think it's really exciting. But others don't think it's so exciting. Some people feel like it's just a spin-off, it's a Warriors game, it's not something that really warrants the holiday release for the year, and it's not really worth it for a lot of Zelda fans. So I'm going to be talking about how this game is more than just a spin-off, how it's going to be a higher quality Warriors game than usual, and how for a lot of Zelda fans it's going to be very valuable, and it's not just a spin-off in the sense that the story won't matter, but how this game may end up being very important for the overarching story for the Zelda series, and going into Breath of the Wild too. Now before we jump into things, I want to quickly talk about my social media. There is a Twitter page, a Discord community, a Patreon page, and a Twitch channel. If you are interested in any of that, check it all out, it's linked in the description below, and of course, if you like what you're watching here, also subscribe. To get things started, let's first talk about what a musou game is, because that's what Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is, a musou game. So a musou game is something that's been developed by Koei Tecmo for years. The most popular franchise that comes to mind for the musou games is Dynasty Warriors, and basically it's a hack and slash action game where you run around with some sort of crazy cool weapon and powers, destroying hordes and hordes of enemies. It's a really great style of gameplay that can sort of demonstrate actual wars on battlefields. I was always fascinated by it as a kid, watching the Dynasty Warriors games, playing them for that reason. But that said, the Dynasty Warrior games haven't always reviewed very well. Now, I'm not trying to say that they aren't good games, but there are varying levels of quality when it comes to games here, and when we're talking about like that big holiday release for Nintendo, usually that November-October game that comes out is very high quality. When we're talking about something like Mario Odyssey or Smash Ultimate Breath of the Wild, those games are Game of the Year contender kind of games, and a Warriors game isn't really too close to that. So a lot of people are concerned that this Hyrule Warriors game is gonna be not the kind of game that you would play for the holidays from Nintendo. But I don't think that's gonna be the case. So first, when you take a look at some of the other Warriors games, the ones that have branched off into other franchises, like Fire Emblem Warriors or Hyrule Warriors, when you look at the reviews for those games, they're a little bit higher than your typical Warriors game, especially with Hyrule Warriors. And these style of Warriors games do bring in different mechanics from different series that sort of help that Warriors game to feel a little bit more like that series, but ultimately, it's still pretty much entirely a Warriors game. But let me be clear about something here. I think a game like Hyrule Warriors, like the definitive edition that came out on Switch a while ago, if that were to be the game that came out for the holiday, I would find that to be a little disappointing, because that isn't something that I would say warrants a holiday release. However, this Warriors game, I think it's going to be even better than that, and considering the circumstances with the pandemic and all and how this has been a down year, I'm willing to forgive Nintendo for not having something like Breath of the Wild 2 or Mario Odyssey 2 ready for November. And it isn't the case that every single year during the holidays, we get just Game of the Year contender kind of games from Nintendo. There are other types of games that don't review as well as that. For example, Pokemon, Luigi's Mansion. These are great games that I thoroughly enjoy and sell incredibly well, but they're not going to be 10 out of 10 games for everyone. We don't have to get a 10 out of 10 Game of the Year kind of game every single year for that November time of the year from Nintendo, and considering the circumstances of this year with how slow it's been and the pandemic, I'm willing to accept something that won't be quite as good as that. So what I'm getting at here is that I think Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is going to be a pretty good game. It's going to be better than previous Warriors games, even Hyrule Warriors, by a decent margin, but also I don't expect it to be a Game of the Year kind of game either. It's going to be a really good game that a lot of Zelda fans are going to be really excited about, but I don't think it's going to be that 10 out of 10. Maybe it'll be like a 9 out of 10 kind of game. That's a possibility, potentially. But I really don't want to harp on the numbers here. That's something that's subjective, so let's just stay away from the numbers conversation here. My point is that I think this game is going to be better than previous Warriors games by a decent margin. So why do I think that? Well, there are actually several reasons. Now, the biggest main reason is simply from what I see of the trailer. The trailer looks awesome. The cutscenes look like Breath of the Wild cutscenes. The gameplay looks really cool. We're going to be able to play as the different champions, and from what I've seen so far, some of the mechanics look very Breath of the Wild-like. We saw Urbosa dodge an enemy and go into what looks like a flurry rush. It looks like they might be bringing in some different Breath of the Wild mechanics, and we're going to be able to see the world of Hyrule before the 100 years, before the desolation from the Battle of the Calamity. We're going to be able to experience the world of Hyrule before that all happened. In Breath of the Wild, we just got snippets of that. And Eiji Aonuma came out with his presentation talking about Hyrule Warriors, saying how he wanted the Koei Tecmo team to bring the Warrior-style gameplay, because that's focusing on wars, to tell the story of this war that took place 100 years beforehand, so we could get a better understanding and perspective of the characters and the world of Hyrule before Breath of the Wild. And that's really exciting. This is being presented as a prequel, and that's really cool. But what's also really cool is that during this presentation where they announced Hyrule Warriors, Eiji Aonuma told us that the Zelda team has been working closely with Koei Tecmo on this game, on the story, on the visuals, on the gameplay. So they are trying to make sure that this game is going to be of a higher quality, something that warrants the Breath of the Wild name, or at least the Breath of the Wild universe. So I really do feel like this is going to feel like an appropriate prequel, just with a different style of gameplay, and it's going to be pretty darn good. Hyrule Warriors is already considered one of the best musou style kind of games, but with Nintendo working closely with Koei Tecmo on this one I believe is going to be far better, because it's going to have that Nintendo imprint, that quality standard is going to be there. They are overseeing this game and helping out with this game, so I think it's going to be a lot better than your typical Warriors game. And we've actually seen another example of a game like Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, and that's Persona 5 Scramble. Now, Persona 5 Scramble hasn't come out yet, and admittedly, I haven't played it myself, but from what we've heard, this game is pretty darn good. It's better than your typical Warriors game. The gameplay is sort of described as more of a Persona game with the Warrior-style gameplay. It's a closer fusion than your typical Warriors game. It's been described as a Persona 5 sequel, but instead of using the turn-based RPG gameplay, they are using the hack-and-slash action gameplay, but still telling the story of Persona 5, expanding upon that universe, and this Warriors game is a closer fusion with the other franchise, this time being Persona, and that's making it feel a lot more like Persona 5 than your typical Warriors game would. So Persona 5 Scramble to me is really reassuring, because it's an example of a Warriors game taking it to the next level. And with Nintendo and the Zelda team working very closely on this one, I think it's going to be even better, especially because they are releasing it this November. I don't think Nintendo would have dropped this game during the November time if they didn't think the quality of this game would warrant that type of excitement. I think this game is going to be pretty good. It's going to be a prequel. We're going to get a whole bunch of story and lore about the Breath of the Wild series. The gameplay, I think, is going to be even closer to the Breath of the Wild gameplay than the previous Hyrule Warriors games or the Zelda gameplay. That's what's being suggested with Persona 5 Scramble and the Zelda team working very closely on this project. So I feel reassured that Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is going to be more than just a spin-off. But there's one more potentiality that we haven't focused on yet, and that's having to do with how this game may bridge everything for Breath of the Wild 2. So this game is being treated as a prequel, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, okay? It leads into the story for Breath of the Wild, which then leads into the story for Breath of the Wild 2. So what we know so far is that the Age of Calamity is going to tell us a lot more about what happened during the time of the war, the Calamity, 100 years before the events of Breath of the Wild. Then at the end of Breath of the Wild, they stop the Calamity entirely, they stop Calamity Ganon, but in Breath of the Wild 2, they go exploring for the root of that cause, and they find Ganondorf, who then starts coming back to life, and I can only imagine will cause a whole bunch of crazy things to happen. From what we've seen of Age of Calamity, it's going to be telling us a lot more about what happened then. We've already seen some interesting glimpses already. For example, we saw the Guardians coming out of those giant pillars that erupted from the ground. We even see that there are going to be some battles with the Yiga as well. It seems because the Zelda team is working with Koei Tecmo on this game, they're going to be able to fill in details that they weren't able to present in Breath of the Wild, like those Guardians, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more about the Yiga. Maybe we'll see another leader from then that will perhaps be a little scarier or more daunting, or simply a personality that will be a little bit more compelling than the one we see in Breath of the Wild. It looks like we're going to get to see a little bit more what the Calamity causes and where it's coming from. Not only that, we're going to be seeing more about these different characters, including Urbosa, and Urbosa already has spoken of a history of Ganondorf being something that the Gerudo are not proud of, but has become the Calamity, so maybe we'll get even more details on that. Maybe all of these things will hint at what's to come for Breath of the Wild 2. They could give us a little bit more background about what's going on with Ganondorf under Hyrule Castle. And another thing to consider here is that Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is being used as that game to lead up into Breath of the Wild 2. We've seen Nintendo do this beforehand. For example, in 2016, we saw Twilight Princess HD the year before Breath of the Wild, and we've seen interviews from Eiji Aonuma how he talked about how there are some details in Twilight Princess that could give us a bit more perspective on Breath of the Wild. And we sort of debated this over the last few years, but now with Breath of the Wild 2, we know that Ganondorf is going to be playing a vital role for that game, and it's the same Ganondorf from Twilight Princess. So we may see something similar in Age of Calamity that could give us more perspective on the events that will take place in both Breath of the Wild 1 and 2. And as a huge Breath of the Wild fan, to get more juicy details about the story for Breath of the Wild 2 is more than enough reason alone to go and get this game. But anyways everyone, those are my thoughts on the matter. I'm thinking this game is going to be a pretty good prequel in terms of story. It may hint at some things for Breath of the Wild 2. In terms of gameplay, it's going to exceed previous Warriors games in terms of quality, and it's going to feel a little bit more like Breath of the Wild. And I think that's going to be pretty cool, and I'm just really excited to play this as a Zelda fan. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. This is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.